Figurative language. Figurative language is language that goes beyond the literal meaning of a word, and authors will use figurative language to enhance their writing. Some common examples of figurative language are hyperbole, simile, metaphor, and personification. So we'll discuss each of those and I'll give you some examples for each. Hyperbole is exaggeration. People will say something and you aren't meant to take it literally. You're meant to know it's an exaggeration, but it's there just to emphasize how strongly the author is trying to convey something. For instance, I've told you 1,000,000 times. I bet some of you have probably heard that one. And 1,000,000 times, really? Probably you haven't heard whatever your parent or teacher has said they've told you 1,000,000 times. It's an exaggeration. It's hyperbole. It's meant to emphasize that they've already told you this a lot more times before now. Another example would be, I had a ton of homework. You did not literally go home with 2,000 pounds of homework, but you're telling people I had a lot of homework. It was way more than the normal amount. It was a ton. It was that much homework. So that's what hyperbole is, exaggeration. Next we've got simile, which is comparing two things using like or as. And this is very important. You have to use those words like or as, or it's not going to be a simile anymore. So, the child howled like a coyote. We see our word like. You're comparing two things in this sentence. The child howled like a coyote compares the child to a coyote using the word like. This example is letting you know that the child is loud. Its crying sounds like a howl, much like a coyote. So this figurative language is used to bring a coyote to mind to help you picture and hear in your mind how this child is screaming or crying. Next, let's look at this example. She ran as fast as lightning. Well, that's going to compare two things here, and we see the word as. So what is being compared in this sentence? She ran as fast as lightning. And usually when you have one as, you've got two. So it's comparing she, or a girl, to lightning. And that is being done by using the word as. So when you're comparing a girl to lightning, you're saying she's that fast. It went so fast you barely got to see her before she got past you or got to the finish line. So it's just letting you know she's really, really fast. So that's what simile is, comparing two things using like or as. And again, these are the important words to look for to make it actually be a simile. It could be a metaphor, which compares two things without using like or as. And that is really the big difference between a simile and a metaphor. A simile uses like or as. A metaphor does not use like or as. So let's look at some metaphor examples. She was lightning running down the track. So this sentence is very similar to this one. They're both comparing she, or a girl, to lightning. They're both saying this girl is really fast, but this one just says she was lightning. She was lightning running down the track. It doesn't say she ran as fast as lightning. It doesn't use like or as. It just says she was lightning. So it's a different way to use the same kind of figurative language. So that's one example of a metaphor. Let's look at this. And this is an excerpt from Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. Now this one's a little trickier because it doesn't just come out and say, this was this, or this is this. Like here it said she was lightning. But it says that his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. So we're comparing his eyes to a demon's eyes, which is basically comparing him, or a man, to a demon. If his eyes are like a demon's eyes, then this man is being compared to a demon, which is to maybe say that the man is evil. It doesn't mean he's literally a demon. It means he's got some characteristic of a demon. He's maybe an evil person. So in poetry, your figurative language may not always pop out at you if it's a metaphor. A simile is pretty easy to spot because you'll see like or as. But a metaphor might be a little trickier. So just look for what two things are being compared in that sentence or that phrase of a poem. And the last piece of figurative language we're going to discuss is personification, which is when an inanimate object is given human qualities. You are personifying it. You are making it do something a person would do, even though it's not something that can do these things. And remember, inanimate objects are going to be things that are not alive. A chair, a teapot, the wind, water. Those are inanimate objects. So the example here, the water slapped the side of the boat. The water slapped. Can water actually slap like a person would slap? No, but it makes you think of the action of slapping and the sound you might hear with the slap whenever you picture this water slapping the side of the boat. And that's why they're using this particular word and personifying the water. Depending on what the story is about where this sentence appears, it could be that the water is being made as like an evil character. If someone drowns in this story, then the water would be seen as an enemy, and so it slapping the side of the boat would give it that negative feeling. Another example, the teapot shrieked. Shrieking, screaming, that loud sound, you can hear it in your head when you think about the noise a teapot makes. But a teapot isn't actually shrieking like a person would. It's simply making that noise because the air is hot enough that it's trying to get out now. Or the wind howled. Wind can't howl like a wolf would howl, but wind makes that same kind of sound sometimes, and so the author is trying to put that sound of howling in your mind when they're describing the wind. So figurative language can be a lot of different things. Hyperbole, where you're exaggerating. Simile, where you're comparing two things using like or as. Very important markers for a simile. Metaphor, where you're comparing two things without using like or as. And personification, when an object is given human qualities, whenever it's personified. And all of these techniques are used so that the words will go beyond the literal meaning of them and give you a deeper understanding of the poem or the work that you're reading. The author is trying to go beyond the words and make you really think about their meaning and put certain connotations in your head whenever you're reading. Context. Sometimes when you're reading and you come across a word that you don't know, you can use context clues to make an educated guess as to what the word means. Now when you're looking at the word you don't know, you don't want to just look right before and after the word. You usually want to look at the sentence before and the sentence after. And sometimes you even have to look at the whole paragraph to get an idea of what that unfamiliar word means. Now, there are some clues that we can look at to help determine what the word means. One thing you can look at is a description. Sometimes a sentence or a sentence following or before the unfamiliar word will give you a description. For instance, the green-feathered macaw. Well, you may not know the word macaw, but by seeing green-feathered, you can infer that it is some kind of a bird with green feathers. Another clue you could look at are synonyms. If you hear the soft and supple leather, well, since you have soft here and then supple, both describing leather, you can figure out that supple probably has something to do with being soft. And in reality, it means moldable. It's easily moldable, and it is somewhat soft to be able to do that. We'll go ahead and note that this one was our bird. Now another clue you can look for are antonyms. Angie is sweet. She doesn't have a malevolent bone in her body. Well, you may not know what malevolent means, but you probably know what sweet means. And if she isn't malevolent and she is sweet, then you can figure out malevolent is something bad, something negative, the opposite of sweet. And in reality, malevolent means evil. Another clue you can look for are definitions. Sometimes the sentence before, after, or part of the same sentence your word is in will just give you the definition of the word. For instance, the echidna, an egg-laying mammal native to Australia, and then they might tell you some interesting fact about the echidna. Well, in commas, right after echidna is the definition of an echidna, an egg-laying mammal native to Australia. So you know what it is right there. The last clue you can look for is tone. Is the rest of this paragraph positive, negative, happy, scared? If you have a paragraph that's all one tone, then the word probably has something to do with that. If it's a scary tone, then this may be a word that it has to do with something scary. If it's positive, it may be a happy kind of word. So you can always take that into consideration whenever you are taking your educated guess. So once you've looked at clues and you've tried to figure out, looking before and after the sentence your word is in, looking at the whole paragraph, seeing if you can find a description, a synonym, an antonym, a definition, or figure out the tone surrounding that unfamiliar word, you want to take a guess as to what the word means. And then you want to reread the sentence to see if it makes sense to you and ask yourself, does it make sense? So if we were to insert bird here, the green feathered bird. Well, if it's something that has feathers and we have bird after it, that makes sense, so that one would work. The soft and supple leather. So if we know it means something else soft, maybe moldable, we could say the soft and moldable leather, the soft and flexible leather. Any kind of word like that that you put in that was similar to soft would work. It would make sense in your sentence. Okay? We were thinking evil here, something the opposite of sweet. Angie is sweet. She doesn't have an evil bone in her body. That makes sense. She is sweet. She doesn't have an evil bone. Now, the echidna sentence is a little different. If they plug in a definition for you, then it's a little harder to check. You would just say, an egg-laying mammal native to Australia, and then maybe tell the sentence after that point, because the definition's already there for you. There's not really a synonym for echidna or anything else you could have come up with for what that one meant. And once you've checked to make sure they all make sense, then you have a pretty good idea of what that word means. And you can see how using these context clues of looking for a description, a synonym, an antonym, a definition, or the tone of a paragraph can help you figure out that pesky, unfamiliar word. Inference. Inferences are conclusions that a reader makes using clues in the text. So an author may not explicitly say something, but they leave little hints behind, and you have to connect the dots to form a conclusion. And inference is different than making a guess because it is based on evidence. So you read, you pick up on those clues or hints that the author leaves behind, and you put them all together to form your inference. So let's look at a couple of examples. Charlotte's toddler is in bed asleep upstairs. She hears a loud thump and then loud crying. So knowing that the toddler is in bed asleep and then hearing a thump and crying, you can infer, or Charlotte can infer when she's at home, that her toddler fell out of bed. Now, our example doesn't say the toddler fell out of bed. and it doesn't say Charlotte ran upstairs and found her child on the floor. But because you know the kid was in a bed sleeping, and then you hear a thump, probably against the floor, and then crying because the kid is hurt or scared from waking up in the middle of the night on the floor unexpectedly, Charlotte can infer that her toddler fell out of bed, or the reader can infer that that's what happened whenever they're trying to process the story and figure out what the author was trying to tell them with these clues. So let's look at another example. Nolan sees cookie crumbs on the floor and chocolate around his son's mouth. So cookie crumbs on the floor, chocolate around his mouth is going to tell you that Nolan's son got into the cookie jar. And it may not be the cookie jar, it may be that he got into a pack of cookies, but you don't really know the rest of that. You just know that if there are cookie crumbs on the floor and chocolate around his son's mouth, that the kid got into cookies somehow. So you can infer he got into a cookie jar or a pack of cookies without the author explicitly saying that to you. And that's all it is. That's all inference is. Reading something and coming to a conclusion. A lot of the times it's really obvious things. If you see a lady come into a store and she's dripping wet and it's raining outside, you can infer that she doesn't have an umbrella. So some things are just common sense. They come to you. You don't even realize you're making an inference. But in the end, an inference is just a conclusion that a reader makes based on evidence. Persuasive essays. When writing a persuasive essay, the writer will try to convince the reader to adopt the opinion of the writer on a particular issue. They do this in many different ways, but they should demonstrate a keen understanding of their audience. You need to know who you're writing to, who you're trying to convince of this opinion. Consider the interests, prior knowledge, and learning styles of the audience. So think about who you're writing to. Are they going to be interested in this topic to start with, or are you going to have to get them interested? Are they going to have any prior knowledge about this, or is this the first time they're going to be reading about it? How do they learn? What's the best way that you could support your thesis so that they would eventually adopt your opinion? These are all things to think about when you're writing. At the beginning of every essay, you're going to want to develop your thesis. Now, the thesis is going to be in the introduction of your persuasive essay, but it's going to be at the end, not at the beginning. So in most papers, your thesis will be at the beginning of that introductory paragraph, but not in a persuasive essay. Because in a persuasive essay, you want to establish credibility first. You want to win the trust of the audience, or at least their interest, before you tell them what you're trying to convince them of. And one way to do this is to use an anecdote or story. If you start off your paper with a short anecdote or story, it kind of warms the audience to you. You may give them a little bit more information that lets them know you are a credible source to be talking about this topic, and then introduce your thesis. Then introduce what it is you're going to be trying to convince them of in this persuasive essay. Now, once you've established your thesis, there are several ways that you can develop it, but we're going to discuss 3 different persuasive essay techniques today. One is making claims. You're going to give lots of supporting ideas to your main argument, so you should have small claims along the way that support the central argument. You make one big claim at the beginning when you tell people what it is you're writing about, what it is you're trying to convince them of, but you're going to make several small claims along the way that support that central argument. Claims should be rooted in fact and observation. These claims cannot be something that is just your opinion. It can't be something you made up. You can't say, I think chocolate ice cream is the best ice cream. You could say, I think an ice cream parlor should serve more varieties of chocolate ice cream. And you could back that up by going and doing some research, looking to see what kind of money the store might make if they had different ice cream flavors. And you could back it up. There's facts, there's observations, there's statistics you could look at. But if you just say, chocolate's the best, there should be more chocolate, that's just your opinion. It's not a small claim that would be confirmable. And that leads us to this part. Must be confirmed. Any facts that you include, any observations must be confirmable. You must be able to go back and show where you found them, show that it's a true statement. So, with any persuasive essay, include references when possible. Show where you got this information. Don't make the reader go find it. Present it to them to show that you are being upfront about this. What you're saying is true. What you're saying is the right thing, and they should believe you. It further establishes trust with them. Another way that you can develop your thesis is with examples and expert opinions. Examples are most effective when they complement facts. So you've laid out some facts and observations. Now give some examples that support those, because examples are a good way to make dry facts more interesting or understandable. Sometimes a writer will present a fact and you'll say, I don't really know what they mean by that. But if they give you an example to back it up, then you say, oh, that's what they meant. So using an example can make your audience understand what you're trying to tell them better and make it more interesting, because sometimes facts are dry and hearing a lot of facts in a row may just be boring and may not actually pull your reader's interest toward that opinion you're trying to convince them of. If you use an expert opinion, your expert should have a title or credential of some sort that clearly indicates the expert's knowledge and experience in the topic. So if you're saying someone is an expert on, let's say, a certain drug, then you may want the doctor to be there to say, oh, well, amoxicillin really does have all these health benefits, and here are all the things that I can tell you about that. You want a doctor. You want him to be able to show he's got a degree in medicine. You don't want it to be just someone that comes on and says, oh yeah, I've given my kid Amoxil several times and my kid always gets better after a cold. That's not what you want. You want someone who's got verifiable credentials to be an expert. Now, we've looked at making claims using facts to support your thesis and using examples and expert opinions to back those up, but you can also look at emotional appeals. Opinions are formed by emotion as well as reason. So these are going to play more on reason, more on logic, where emotional appeals are going to pull on a reader's emotions. These should be used in a proper and ethical manner. And that's important to remember. If you're going to appeal to a reader's emotions, you need to be responsible about it and make sure you're doing it the right way. And let me show you some examples to expand on that. Think about drunk driving ads. Sometimes you may see some really sad and graphic things in those ads, but what's being shown is shown to you to let you know that this is a serious issue, that people should not drive after drinking because there can be terrible consequences. Anyone using that information should be using it to support not drinking and driving. And so even though it's pulling on your emotions, it's doing it for a good reason. But then let's look at politics. A lot of times one candidate will put out an ad saying how patriotic they are, showing how they've served their country and all the ways they're patriotic. And that's really nice, but often it's going to also imply that the other candidate competing against the first one is not very patriotic, and that's usually far from the truth. Meanwhile, that first candidate's patriotism is going to link them to voters. Voters are going to say, oh, I really care about the country too, so I need to go with this guy because he's patriotic and the other one isn't, even though that's not true. So you don't want to mislead your audience with emotional appeals. And one other way that that can be done is with loaded language. If someone is extremely religious and they are called a fanatic, the word fanatic has a certain connotation to it that is negative. The same way if someone was environmentally conscious and someone called him a tree hugger, that has a negative connotation. So using loaded language words like that can give negative connotations and pull on a reader's emotions that way. And that's not what you want to do. You want to use it to support your argument, but not put down other things. So whenever you're writing a persuasive essay, make sure you're keeping in mind who your audience is, what their interests are, how much they may already know about the topic, and what's going to help them the most. And then you can decide if you want to use small claims along the way, expert opinions and examples, or emotional appeals to back up your thesis. But the most important thing you're going to need to do is to win your audience's trust. You want to establish that you're credible so that you can convince them that your opinion is the correct one. Point of view. The point of view is the perspective from which a story is told, and the narrator is the person who tells the story. So when we're looking for point of view, we're looking to see if we have a first-person narrator or a third-person narrator that's telling us the story. In first person, your narrator is going to be your main character, and they're going to be saying I, me, we. These are the pronouns you're going to see associated with the first-person narrator. If it's the main character, you're only going to get to know what the main character knows. You're only going to get to read about what that main character does or what he does with someone else. But you won't know about anything that doesn't happen involving the main character because this is written from a first-person point of view and you're only going to hear from this viewpoint. Third person is the most common point of view. And you're going to see pronouns like he, she, and they. The narrator is going to talk about other characters, but the narrator is not one of the characters. And third person omniscient is very common as well. Omniscient means all-knowing. So a third person omniscient narrator is going to be one who describes all other characters. So at once. So this narrator is going to be able to tell you what every other character in the story is thinking, what every other character in the story is doing. Now they may not actually do it all in the same passage. Sometimes they split it into chapters. So one chapter is written to where the author is telling you everything that Johnny does. One chapter is split to tell you everything that Susie does. So you find out everyone's point of view, but possibly at different times. But the author is able to do all that without actually being a part of the story. So whenever you're looking for who your narrator is, the pronouns are the important thing to look at. Let's look at this passage. John walked to school every day. He and his friends were often cold and tired by the time they arrived. They were allowed to warm up by the stove before sitting in their seats. In this passage, let's look at the pronouns to help determine the point of view. And your pronouns are going to be words that take the place of nouns, such as I, me, we, he, she, they, it, you. But these are going to be the ones that are really going to set you off as markers to let you know if it's a first person or third person narrator that you're listening to. So looking through this, we have he and his friends. By the time they arrived, they were allowed to warm up by the stove before sitting in their seats. And it started with John. So the narrator is using he and they and someone's name. Now, first person could use someone's name, and that's why it's important to look at the pronouns. But the narrator starts talking about John, and then he uses all of these third person pronouns. The narrator is a third person narrator here. Oh, let's write it out. Third person. And you know this because you're looking at the pronouns. And the pronouns are all telling you that the narrator is telling you what's happening, but the narrator is not a part of the action. So the point of view is a third-person point of view. So whenever you're going to find point of view, you want to know this because the perspective of the story, who it's coming from, is important. If it's coming from a certain character, or if it's coming from a first-person or a third-person point of view, then you're going to have a different plot or have information, more intimate information in first person and a greater variety of information with third person. So it's always important to determine your point of view whenever you are reading a story. So just keep in mind that the best way to find that is by looking at the pronouns, I, me, and we, he, she, and they. Purpose. An author writes with one of four purposes in mind: to inform, to describe, to entertain, or to persuade. Once we figure out which one of these four purposes the author is writing with, we will be able to better understand his or her motivations for writing. If the author is writing to inform, it will probably be nonfiction. And some examples you might see are research papers or recipes. You are getting information. The author is informing you of something. They're informing you how to do something. It's nonfiction. Their purpose is simply to inform you. If the author's purpose is to describe, it will probably be fiction, and it's going to have lots of details. A descriptive story or paper is going to elaborate on details. It's going to give you as much description as possible, and a lot of times that's going to be something that's a work of fiction. While you will have details in an informational paper or writing of some sort, it's not going to be the same kind of details you'd get in a descriptive fictional narrative. If the author's purpose is to entertain, then it will also probably be fiction, and you will have humorous and or dramatic elements. Now, something that's funny or humorous is going to be entertaining, but something dramatic can be just as entertaining as something funny. And some of the best stories are going to have humorous and dramatic elements in them. So something written to entertain is usually fiction, and it will sometimes have both of these elements, or sometimes just one or the other. But it's written to entertain you, to make you feel entertained, like you are reading a story that you are enjoying. If the author is writing to persuade you of something, you are probably going to see an editorial or an advertisement. All those ads you see on TV are meant to persuade you to buy something, persuade you that one product is better than another. So that is where advertisements are going to be one of the primary places that you see persuasion writing. An editorial in a newspaper may lean toward or against a certain topic or candidate in a political campaign, and so those are also written to persuade you one way or the other. But most people are going to see ads on almost a daily basis, whether it's on the internet, whether it's on the TV, whether it's on a billboard driving down the highway. So this is something you'll see every day, whether you're trying to or not. So the four main purposes an author will write with are to inform, to describe, to entertain, or to persuade. And once you determine what the author's purpose in writing is, you will better be able to determine the author's motivation for crafting his work.
Transitions are very helpful to the reader because they help the reader transition from one thought to another or one concept to another. Transitions can be placed at the beginning of a sentence or in the middle of a sentence, either to help the reader transition from one sentence to another or from one part of the sentence to another part of the sentence. So I want to take a look at many different kinds of transition words and phrases that can be used and how they can be used accurately in sentences. So first of all, transitions can be broken up into different kinds of transitions. So some transitions show addition, like the transitions next and in addition. Remember I said that we can also have transition phrases, and so this is a prepositional phrase acting as a transition. Another type of transition is a summary, like in conclusion or finally. And there's some transitions that show sequence, like later or then. And then finally, some transitions show contrast, like although or meanwhile. So how can you effectively use these transitions in sentences? Many times the transition word or transition phrase needs to go at the beginning of the sentence. Like here, this sentence says, next, bake the cookies for 10 minutes. So we put the transition at the beginning of the sentence and put a comma after it. Now, generally, commas come in pairs in sentences when they are showing that a certain part of the sentence isn't needed. So notice here that next could be removed from the sentence, and we could just read the sentence like this, bake the cookies for 10 minutes, and it would still make sense. So usually when you have some kind of phrase or word that could be omitted from the sentence, you put commas on both sides of it. Like here's part of a sentence, then there's a comma, here's the part of the sentence that isn't needed, another comma, and then the rest of the sentence. But when a word or phrase comes at the beginning or the end of a sentence, you only need one comma because you wouldn't put a comma before next. That would look funny. So you just put a comma after it to show that next isn't there. So although next isn't essential to the sentence, it's helpful because it helps the reader understand the transition from one thought to another. In this case, the next step in directions on how to bake cookies. All right, this next sentence says, although I enjoy the outdoors, I do not like to run. Although is a transition that shows contrast. And notice here there's not a comma right after although. It's placed after outdoors. But again, although I enjoy the outdoors could be removed from the sentence, and it would still make sense. It would just say, I do not like to run. Nevertheless, this part of the sentence is still important to the overall paper. Now, notice that in certain cases, you have to continue the sentence for it to make sense. Like here, it wouldn't matter whether next was here or not. But since you've put although right here, you have to finish the sentence. You couldn't say, although I enjoy the outdoors. Because I enjoy the outdoors makes sense by itself, but once you add although to it, you're telling the reader that there's something else that needs to come. So after you put, although I enjoy the outdoors, you have to put, I do not like to run to finish out the sentence. So the things that are important to remember from this session is that there are many different kinds of transitions that can be classified into different categories. And there's many more categories we could have listed and many more transitions we could have listed under each category. And then generally, the transition word or phrase is going to go at the beginning of the sentence. And in this case, where there's a phrase at the beginning of the sentence that is started off by a transition word, make sure you finish the sentence and don't leave the reader hanging by writing a fragment.
When taking your exam, you may come across questions where they ask you to determine fact from opinion. And sometimes this can be a little tricky. Obviously, when taking a test, if you know the right answer, you always go with what you know is the right answer. But if you find yourself in a situation where you're not entirely sure what the right answer is, perhaps you're running short on time, maybe 2 or 3 of the answers look like they might be correct, this little bit of advice might be very helpful, especially on this kind of question, whether it's fact or opinion. When asked about a statement, whether it's fact or opinion, remember that choices that are facts will have no ambiguous words in them. They typically will have no ambiguous words. Let me give you an example here. Listen to this sentence. How long is a long time? Well, of course, that's extremely ambiguous because long, in reference to time, may be up to each person. My young son thinks that 5 minutes is a long time, and yet 5 minutes is not nearly enough time in my experience. So the ambiguity of the word long there tips you off that this is opinion rather than fact. And it's typically this case. Let me give you one more to show you what I mean. What defines an ordinary person? Well, what's ordinary to me may not be ordinary to you or ordinary to someone else. That word ordinary, once again, is ambiguous. It's left up to each person's opinion. So that lets you know, all right, we're talking opinions here. Now, sometimes it's not clear. You may say, well, all of them seem to have some words of ambiguity in them. Well, once again, like I said, this is typically the case that fact statements typically will not have words of opinion. But if you find a situation where they all seem to have words of ambiguity, the next thing you look for is the complete context of the question. And given that context, what you usually find is that the fact answer comes out in terms of a research finding. So let me give you an example of that. The scientist found that the eye reacts quickly to change in light. So the research finding there, given the whole context of the question there, will let you know that, okay, this is the fact here. Even though there may be some ambiguity in there, I don't know the scientist, I don't know what he found, the fact that it's a research finding says, okay, this is a fact. So typically you're looking for ambiguous words, lets you know opinion, but looking at the whole context you may see, I don't see any here, just merely of facts. They all have ambiguous words. You look at the whole context and you say, okay, well, here's a research finding, that's the factual one there. So opinions are set out in the context of words like so-and-so thought something, they believed something, they understood something, they wished something. So you're looking for those opinion words, thought, believed, understood, wished. And here's an example of that. He thought the Yankees should win the World Series. That's not a statement of fact, it's a statement of opinion. And we know that because we're tipped off immediately by that word, thought. He believed, he wished that the Yankees should win the World Series. Now, hopefully this little technique will help you out when you're taking your test. And once again, I want to reiterate, if you know the right answer, always go with that. But when you hit a little stumbling block, when you're not entirely sure, this will help you make a better educated guess. Fact statements avoid ambiguous terminology or are often listed as research results. Opinion statements, once again, have ambiguous terminology that's up to my perception, your perception, someone else's perception, and often include the words thought, believed, wished, or understood. If you'd like to learn more about this, study further, I encourage you to go to the website linked beneath this video. If you click on the link, it'll take you there where you'll find an ebook ready for immediate download.
A technical passage is a piece of writing used to describe a complex object or process. So that's the main point of a technical passage, to describe a complex object or process. Because of that, a technical passage is always going to be nonfiction. Many times technical passages will relate to something in the medical or technological fields. I'm just going to abbreviate technological. So technical passages could be about many different types of fields, but generally things in the medical and technical fields are complex, so that's why a lot of technical passages will relate to those fields. So the goal of an author when writing a technical passage is to state everything simply and clearly. In order to accomplish that goal, the author has several tactics it will often use to state everything simply and clearly. The first is by putting everything in a logical order. The second tactic is to use subheadings and headings. And the third tactic is to use letters and numbers. That sounds very vague, but what I'm talking about here is by numbering the main points or using letters to separate sections of the paper. And because of using lots of subheadings and headings and letters and numbers, oftentimes a passage will appear more like an outline than an actual piece of writing. But nevertheless, that's fine because the goal of the writer here is to describe the complex object or process simply and clearly. So that's the important thing to pay attention to there. So just to review, a technical passage is for the purpose of describing a complex object or process. And everything needs to be stated simply and clearly, so the three tactics an author can use are logical order, subheadings and headings, and letters and numbers. A bias is basically when an author is unfair or inaccurate in his or her presentation of something. In their attempt to persuade, writers often make mistakes in their thinking patterns and writing choices. This is because every author has a point of view. And that's important to remember. Every author has a point of view, which is basically just the way they look at something, the way they see a certain situation. So because they have this point of view, naturally in their writing, they oftentimes will show their point of view through their writing. And so that's when a bias comes into play. So it's not necessarily bad for an author to have a point of view. They're just naturally going to have one. But it is a problem when they start to include it in their writing. So that's when a bias comes into play. And so a bias is when someone ignores reasonable counter-arguments or distorts opposing viewpoints. So you as a reader need to be aware when an author is being biased. So look for any clues, like when they only talk about their own arguments for something and don't talk about any opposing ideas. Or when you are aware of another viewpoint and they share the viewpoint, but they don't share it exactly correct. So be aware of those types of things. And then once you are tipped off once that a writer is being biased, you will know that other times when they present opinions, that those opinions may also be biased. Characters are an essential part of every story. So characters can be classified into two main categories, flat and round. The terms flat and round pertain to how much the character changes throughout the story. So flat characters have little change in personality throughout the story, or many times no change in personality. They're very predictable, they're always the same. And because they're predictable, they can be considered not very interesting. So that's why they play small roles in the story. The main characters of a story are never going to be flat characters. Instead, they're going to be round characters, because round characters incur lots of change throughout the course of a story. So they play the main roles. So flat characters and round characters both contribute a lot to a story. Obviously, round characters are needed to play the main roles because they're going to be developing and changing a lot, and that's what moves the plot along. The plot is moved along by changes in characters' personalities. Flat characters are also needed, however, because they play the smaller roles in the story, the supporting roles that make the main characters very interesting. So when we're talking about round characters, you probably heard me use the word development. And that's what authors try to do with round characters. They try to develop the characters, and it's the development of the characters that moves the plot along. If the characters stay the same, throughout the entire story, then the plot's not very interesting because the plot's not going to progress very much. So round characters are essential to moving the plot along. But the important thing to take away from this, if you remember one thing, is that characters can be split up into flat characters and round characters. Flat characters having the same personality and round characters changing in personality throughout the story. Almost any type of writing is descriptive, and then it seeks to describe a certain person, place, thing, or idea. But a descriptive text is more specific, and then it takes one particular subject and then tries to depict that clearly to the reader. So we could say that a descriptive text focuses on one subject. So it focuses on one subject and then tries to depict that subject clearly to the reader. And when you think of describing something, that means using lots of adjectives and adverbs, lots of descriptive words. So, as you can imagine, a descriptive text is going to have lots of adjectives and adverbs. So I'm just going to abbreviate adjective and adverb. So when you think about a descriptive text, that means it's going to include details. So you want lots of details in a descriptive text. That's what the writer is going for. So over here you have too many details. Because even though the writer is trying to include lots of details, there can be too many. But on the other end of the spectrum over here, if there's not enough details, the paper can be vague or unclear. So what the writer is trying to accomplish here is a happy medium, somewhere in the middle, where the paper is not vague or unclear. It's very clear and very precise, but there's not so many details that the reader gets bogged down in all of the extra information. So as a writer, you should look to try to go in the middle in a descriptive text. And if you're reading something, you want to read things that are descriptive where the writer has a good balance of details in the paper. The purpose of an expository passage is to enlighten and inform the reader. But to state it more simply, the purpose of an expository passage is to teach. Because the purpose of this type of passage is to teach, everything here is going to be accurate. So that's why it's always going to be in a nonfiction passage. The topic of a passage of this type is always going to be very simple. It's going to be a simple topic. It's also going to be a very easily defined topic, because the writer of one of these types of passages wants the reader to be able to understand what they're saying very easily, because they're trying to teach them something. So everything's going to be very simply stated so that the reader can understand what the writer is saying. Oftentimes, expository passages will contain words like first, next, for example, or therefore. The reason these types of words would be used is because the writer is going to make a point that talks about the topic and then back things up with certain details. So in other words, the writer is going to state a fact and then back it up with details. So he might say, this is because first, second, and finally, or next we're going to talk about this argument for our topic. Or he might give a certain example about a topic and then say, for example, or because of this, therefore. Everything is revolved around teaching. So any words like this or any other words that may go along with teaching something are going to be used in these types of situations. So the important thing to remember is that an expository passage is meant for teaching, and it's going to be nonfiction. An informative text is a very straightforward piece of writing. Basically, the purpose of an informative text is to educate and enlighten the reader. It's basically to convey information from the writer to the reader. So it's very straightforward because it's not persuasive, and so it pertains more to facts and figures. So first off, an informative text is generally nonfiction because it has no reason to be fiction, because it has facts and figures in it, so it's truthful. So that's why it's always nonfiction. It's generally easily comprehensible because the writer wants the reader to understand what the writer is talking about. So they want it to be easily comprehensible to the reader so that the reader can understand everything that's going on. There will also be a clear structure to the paper. Since it's informative, it'll oftentimes have several points or pertain to several things. So many times it'll go from one point to the next, a very clear structure throughout the entire paper. And like we've been saying, it'll have facts and figures in it. And so there won't be really emotional language. It'll be more straightforward. And then also, an informative text generally does not have personal opinions in it, because there's no reason to have personal opinions, because the writer isn't trying to convince the reader in any way. They're trying to just simply convey information to the reader. So that's why personal opinions are not present and are not needed. So the important thing to remember is that an informative text is meant to educate and enlighten the reader. A metaphor is a type of figurative language in which the author equates one thing with that of something else. This sentence says, "The bird was an arrow arcing through the sky." Now here, the bird wasn't actually an arrow, but instead the author is saying the bird is like an arrow arcing through the sky. This is a way for the author to get to think about the bird in a different way and to equate it with an arrow and an arrow making an arc through the sky. This is a way for the author to describe the bird in more detail without being direct and obvious, because the author could say, "The bird swiftly flew through the air and bent through the air, making a big arc." But that's not very interesting. That doesn't evoke emotion on the part of the reader. So instead, in this case, the author chose to use a metaphor, saying the bird was like an arrow arcing through the sky, and because of that, the reader can conclude that the bird must have flown swiftly and then bent through the sky, maybe going up and then coming back down. Now, sometimes authors use metaphors, but they don't directly tell you what they're talking about. Here, we knew that the author was talking about a bird, but look at this sentence. "Swaying skeletons reached for the sky and groaned as the wind blew through them." Here, we don't know exactly what the author is talking about, but we can infer that the author is talking about trees, because it would make sense that trees would sway back and forth, and that maybe at this point it's in the winter and the trees don't have any limbs, so it's just like the skeleton of a tree and it's swaying back and forth. So that would make sense here, and so sometimes it's a little bit difficult to figure out exactly what the author is talking about. In this case, it wasn't, but nevertheless, this is another example of a metaphor where the author is comparing the trees to skeletons, and that allows the reader to look at the trees in a different perspective. Now we're thinking about trees as big skeletons swaying back and forth and groaning. And so that's a way for the author to give us a different perspective about these trees without being real direct and obvious. So just to review, a metaphor is a type of figurative language in which the author equates one thing to that of something else. A prediction is a guess about what will happen next. So when a reader actively engages in whatever they are reading, they naturally make predictions about what will happen next. And they base these predictions off of what they have read, and what they already know. So by taking what they have read and what they already know, a reader can formulate what they think will happen next in the story. So consider this sentence. Staring at the computer screen in shock, Kim blindly reached over for the brimming glass of water on the shelf to her side. So the reader is naturally going to read this and have an idea of what is going to happen next. And the reader will probably notice the word blindly. So Kim is so caught up in what's happening on the computer, she goes for a drink of water, but since she's caught up on what's going on the computer, she reaches over without really looking at the glass of water to grab it. So the reader is going to assume that she's going to knock over the glass of water. Now, that may not be what happens, but still it's a prediction either way. The prediction may come true, and a prediction may not come true. But a reader is naturally going to make predictions about a passage, and making predictions is part of being actively engaged in what the reader is reading. A sequence is the order in which things happen. So it's important that a reader be able to identify the sequence so they can follow along with what is happening in the passage. So a sequence is basically the order in which things happen, or the order of events. To help spot the sequence in a passage, you can look for words like first, then, last, and next. So if you find these words in a passage or other words like it, you'll know that that's showing you some part of the sequence. And so that helps you determine what happened first, then next, and then last. And finally, most sequences will be in chronological order. Basically, chronological means based on time. So if I was talking about my day, I would say, okay, at 7 o'clock I got up, at 7:30 I ate breakfast, at 8 o'clock I went for a run, and then at 12 o'clock I ate lunch. See, that's chronological. It's proceeding through time. Now, some texts might not be in chronological order, and so those can be more confusing when trying to find the sequence. However, sometimes that's the best way to go about writing certain passages, so just understand that not all passages will be in chronological order, but nevertheless, it's important that you understand the sequence of events. So to practice, take a look at this sentence. He walked in the front door and switched on the hall lamp. Notice here that none of these words are present in this passage. However, you can still find what the sequence is here. So you know that he must have walked in the front door first and then switched on the light bulb. That had to happen second, because first he had to get inside the door. So this may seem like a very simple and elementary example, but it's still important to be able to identify the sequence in a passage or sentence.